The house lights were already coming up. The orchestra had begun to fold away their sheet music, the way musicians do when a long night is finally over. And yet Edith Piaf stood alone at the front of the Olympia stage in Paris, one small hand still resting on the microphone, and she would not let the audience go home. It was late in the winter of 1961. She was 45 years old, though the years had pressed on her like decades. Her body was failing her in ways the public did not fully understand. Her doctors had told her, plainly, that she should not be singing at all. But that night, in front of 2,000 people who had come to the most famous music hall in France, something happened that no one in the room had planned for. The concert had reached its scheduled end. The applause had crested and begun to fall. The stagehands were waiting in the wings, and Edith Piaf simply refused to leave. To understand why a room full of strangers stayed in their seats, coats half on, unwilling to move, you have to understand what kind of night it truly was. But what the audience could not fully see from their seats was how much this cost her. By 1961, Edith Piaf was a woman held together by will more than by health. Years of illness, exhaustion, grief, and pain had worn her down. There were nights when she had to be helped toward the stage, her small hands trembling, her body swaying. And then, the moment she stepped into the light, she would straighten, and the frailty would seem to vanish. It was as if the stage itself gave her back something the rest of her life had taken away. Those close to her worried constantly. They watched her from the wings, counting her breaths, ready to move if her legs gave out. They had begged her to rest, to cancel, to let her body heal. And she had refused. In the same quiet, stubborn way, she refused most things she did not want to hear. Because for Edith Piaf, to stop singing was not to rest. To stop singing was to disappear. The stage was the one place where she was not a sick woman, not a fading star, not a body that doctors spoke about in low voices. On the stage, she was simply the voice of Paris, and she was not ready to give that up. So on this night, as on so many others, she walked out to sing, knowing exactly what it would take from her. There was a discipline in her that people often missed beneath the drama of her life. She rehearsed with a fierce, unbending focus. She fought over a single phrase until it broke the heart the way she wanted it to break. The fragility the world saw was real, but so was the iron underneath it. The two lived in the same small body, and neither one ever fully won. And perhaps that was the secret of her hold over an audience. They could feel both at once, the strength and the breaking, and they could not look away from either. The Olympia was not just a stage. For a French singer, it was the summit. Standing on the Boulevard des Capucines, in the heart of Paris, it had heard the greatest voices of the century, and its red velvet seats had a memory of their own. To be booked at the Olympia was to be told you mattered. To sell it out night after night was to be told you were immortal. And in these years, Edith Piaf owned that stage the way few performers ever had. Her comeback seasons at the Olympia had already become legend. Only a short time before, she had walked out in front of a doubting Paris, a city that had begun to whisper that she was finished, too sick, too broken, too far past her best. And she had answered them with a single song. She had lifted her arms, closed her eyes, and given them "Non, je ne regrette rien." No, I regret nothing. And the whole theater had come apart at the seams. The song was not just a melody, it was a statement. A woman who had lost almost everything standing in front of France and declaring that she would take none of it back. That was the Olympia she returned to on this winter night. A room that already loved her, a room that already knew she was living on borrowed time. There is a particular kind of loyalty a city gives to a performer who has become part of its own story, and Paris had given all of it to her. People did not simply buy tickets to see Edith Piaf. They came to be near her, to be able to say one day that they had shared a room with that voice while it was still in the world. Every seat that winter was sold before the doors even opened, and behind the excitement there was a quiet, unspoken understanding running through the whole city that no one could say how many more of these nights there would be. The stage manager gave the signal. The house lights began to come up. This is the moment in every concert when the spell is meant to break. The bright lights tell the audience the truth. It is over. Gather your coats. Step back into the ordinary night. The musicians, tired and satisfied, started to close their folders and unclip their music. In the wings, the crew waited to guide the star gently off stage, as they always did, worried as ever about her strength. But Edith Piaf did not move toward them. She stood at the front of the stage in the harsh rising light, blinking out at a room that was suddenly, awkwardly, half illuminated. And instead of taking her final bow and disappearing, she looked out at all those faces now visible to her, the old couples, the young students, the strangers who had spent their evening with her, and she did not want it to end. Something in her would not accept that this was the last note. Those who were there would later describe the strange stillness that fell. The lights said the night was over. The orchestra said the night was over. But the small woman at the microphone said, without saying a word, that it was not. You could see the thought move across her face. In the ordinary light, she looked, for a moment, like exactly what she was, a tired, aging woman who had given everything she had and had every reason to walk into the dark of the wings and rest. And then something else rose up in her, something older and more stubborn than exhaustion. The audience felt the shift before they understood it. A murmur ran through the seats. Coats that had been lifted were slowly lowered again. 2,000 people leaned back toward the stage, sensing that the evening they thought they knew was about to become something they would never forget. The concert itself unfolded the way her concerts did in those years, like a slow fire. She began quietly, almost carefully, as though testing whether her voice would hold. The audience leaned forward. They always did. There was a hush in the Olympia that no other room in Paris produced, a silence made of 2,000 people all deciding at the same moment not to breathe too loudly. And then, song by song, she grew stronger. Her voice, That huge, aching, impossible voice coming out of such a small body filled every corner of the hall. She sang of love and of loss, of the streets she had come from, of men she had adored and buried, of a Paris that existed now mostly in memory. The older people in the seats felt something loosen in their chests. Many of them had grown up with her. They had heard La Vie en Rose on the radio when the world was younger, when they were younger. To sit in that room and hear her sing was to sit inside their own lives again for a little while. By the final songs, the Olympia was no longer an audience and a performer. It had become one thing, one held breath. And when the last scheduled number ended and the applause rose up like a wave against the walls, everyone assumed, as you would, that the night was complete. They were wrong. What followed was the kind of thing you only hear about years later from the people who were lucky enough to be there. She sang again, and then, when that song ended and the applause thundered up, she did not leave. She sang again after that, and again. One more song became two, became a handful, became a private, unrepeatable encore that no program had listed and no ticket had promised. Each time the applause faded and the crew stepped forward, thinking surely now it was over, she would look back at the orchestra and ask for one more. And no one, not the exhausted musicians, not the anxious people in the wings who feared for her health, not the audience who should have gone home hours before, no one had the heart to stop her. Because they all understood, without saying it aloud, what they were watching. This was a woman singing against the clock. Not the clock on the wall, the other one. The one her doctors could hear and the audience could only feel. Every song she gave them that night was a song she was choosing to spend, from a supply that everyone in that room suspected was running low. And so she stood in the golden light, this tiny, ferocious woman, and she sang and sang, holding the whole of Paris in the room with her, refusing for just a little longer to let the night or anything else take her off stage. And then she did something no one had planned for. She turned back toward the orchestra pit, where the conductor had already lowered his hands, and she asked, quietly, almost like a request between friends, for one more song. The musicians looked at one another. The sheet music was already put away. The hour was late. The star was visibly exhausted. Anyone could see it now, in the full light, the pallor of her face, the way she held herself so carefully upright. Every practical voice in that building had a reason to say no. Rest. Stop. It is finished. Go home. But this was Edith Piaf, and in the small, stubborn set of her shoulders was a lifetime of refusing to be told when she was done. The conductor understood. Slowly, the musicians reached back for the music they had just packed away. Out in the hall, the audience, who had begun to rise, who had begun to reach for their coats, froze. Word passed row to row in an instant, the way it does in a theater. She is going to sing again. And 2,000 people, without being asked, sat back down. The coats came off. The chatter died. The house lights, by some quiet mercy, began to fall once more. For this woman, in this room, the night would end when she said it ended, and not one moment before. When it finally ended, and it did end, because everything does, the audience did not rush for the doors. They stood in the aisles and simply looked at the stage a while longer, as if trying to hold the room in their memory before they stepped outside and lost it. Many of them would talk about that night for the rest of their lives, not because of any single song, but because of what they had felt in that strange, stretched hour when a dying woman refused to say goodbye. Some would try to describe it to their children and grandchildren years later, and find that the words never quite carried it, the way the lights had come up, and she had turned back and asked for one more, and one more, until the ordinary rules of an evening simply dissolved. You had to have been in the room. That was the whole point. You had to have been there. Edith Piaf would not have many years left. The stage she loved would soon go quiet for her. But those who were there had witnessed something the recordings can never quite hold. The sight of a small woman standing in the rising house lights and deciding, by the sheer force of who she was, that Paris would stay with her a little longer. We remember Edith Piaf for her great songs, for La Vie en Rose, for Non, je ne regrette rien. But maybe the truest picture of her is not a song at all. Maybe it is this: a woman at the end of her strength, at the front of the Olympia stage, with every light and every clock telling her the night was over, and quietly, stubbornly, lovingly, refusing to leave.